Welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about Wolfgang Petersen's film from 2004 called Troy. Let's kick this off with a quick synopsis. The movie is set during what we now know as the Trojan War in the Bronze Age. And according to the movie, the powerful city of Troy is ruled by King Priam, while the Greek city-states are led by the ambitious King Agamemnon. The war begins when Paris, a prince of Troy, falls in love with Helen, a queen of Sparta, and takes her back to Troy. This enrages Helen's husband, King Menelaus, who calls upon his brother Agamemnon to wage war against Troy under the pretense of retrieving Helen. Agamemnon amassed a vast Greek army, including the legendary warrior Achilles and his Myrmidons. They all sail across the Aegean Sea to lay siege to Troy. Upon landing, Achilles swiftly leads an assault on the Trojan beaches, desecrating a temple of Apollo in the process. The initial Greek assault is met with stronger than expected resistance from the Trojans, and tensions rise when Achilles refuses to fight due to a personal feud with Agamemnon. Meanwhile, Hector and Paris are trying to defend their city, and then conflict escalates when Hector unknowingly kills Achilles' beloved cousin, Patroclus, who had entered the battle disguised in Achilles' armor. The mission for Greek victory takes a drastic turn as Achilles, now driven by vengeance, challenges Hector to a duel and kills him in single combat. But even this does not end the war. The Greeks, unable to breach Troy's massive walls through sheer force, resort to deception. They construct the infamous Trojan horse, leaving it as a supposed offering to the gods before pretending to retreat. The Trojans, believing that they have won, bring the horse inside their city walls, unaware that Greek soldiers are hidden within. That night, the Greeks emerge from the horse, open the gates, and unleash destruction upon Troy. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, today we'll be joined by Neil Laird, who has worked as a TV director and executive producer for over 100 programs and counting for National Geographic, BBC, Discovery, PBS, and more. His latest book is called Primetime Pompeii. And maybe there's a Primetime Troy on the way? Stick around to the end of the episode to find out more about that. But before we connect with Neil, let's set up two truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, this is something we do on every episode to help you practice what this show is all about, separating fact from fiction. So I'm going to give you 3 facts that you're going to hear throughout this episode, but one of those is really just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, the Trojan War started when Achilles kidnapped Agamemnon's wife, Helen. Number 2, we know there was a Troy, but we don't even know if there was a Trojan horse. Number 3, one-on-one duels were common literature tools, but not an ancient battle strategy. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie. And if you're watching the video version of this, you'll see I'm holding up an envelope. This envelope has the answer inside. So we'll open this up at the end of the episode to see if you got it right. Okay, now it's time to connect with Neil Laird about the historical accuracy of Troy. Before we look at some of the details of the movie, I always like to kick things off with an overall letter grade. Now, our movie today adds a little extra challenge since it's ancient history, and that often means there's a mix of myth and legends as well. What letter grade would you give 2004's Troy for its historical accuracy?
I mean, it is a tricky one. We've talked before in the other podcast that it's easier when you're looking at something that happens and not in the full light of history, certainly in history. And the Trojan War, as we will talk about, is almost all myth, although we know there's a Troy and other things. So I would say on that level, looking at how it's based, if you say how it is based on Homer and the story we know, I'd probably give it a C. They take a lot of liberties, which we'll get into. Again, we're not talking about history. We're talking about, are they sticking to the source material?
Now, at the beginning of the movie, we see 2 princes of Troy named Paris and Hector visiting King Menelaus of Sparta to solidify a peace between Troy and Sparta. That peace is short-lived in the movie when Paris falls for the queen of Sparta, Helen, and brings her back to Troy with him. That understandably enrages her husband, the king of Sparta, who happens to be the brother of a Greek power-hungry warlord named Agamemnon. So that's basically the casus belli that Agamemnon needs to attack Troy, which the movie also seems to suggest is something he's always wanted to do anyway. How much of this justification for war between the Greeks and Trojans really happened?
Well, here's an interesting, answer to that, because some of that is based on Bronze Age life, and they get that right. Most of the stuff you talked about didn't happen at all in Homer. There's the thing about the Iliad, for those who haven't read it. Even though we think about the Iliad as the 10 years of Trojan War that ends with Achilles' death and the Trojan horse and all that, none of that happens in the book. What happens in the book is about the last 50 days of a 10-year siege. So when we open up, it's already the 10th year. Trojans are already frustrated and tired, and they want to go back to Greece, and the Trojans are looking down and thumbing their nose. So all the stuff we talk about is really that great drama between Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon and everything. So we don't know what spurred on the war other than two sources. One is in the Odyssey, if you would call it a sequel, which I suppose is the world's first sequel. It's about Odysseus coming home after the war, also being lost for 10 years, and then finally getting back to Ithaca and trying to get Penelope back and all that. And it's only there where we get some information about how Achilles died, if we talk about, and also about how Paris and Helen shacked up and why. And the little he says, which is the few lines, is that there was some sort of meeting in Mycenae where Agamemnon, the king, lived, and Paris and Hector were there, and then Helen left with Paris. We don't know, under duress. We don't know if she fell in love. Most sources suggest that she actually went willingly. Homer's very ambivalent about it. Helen is barely a character in the Iliad, which is interesting, even though she's the one that launches 1,000 ships. She's rather passive, so you don't know if she loves Paris or if she was dragged off and she's trying to get out. She's very, very much in the shadows. But conversely, how they describe Agamemnon and how they describe all the tribes of Greece is quite fascinating. As a historian, as someone who loves history, that's pretty close to how Bronze Age life was. It was very much a series of city-states. And the Bronze Age, for those who don't know, was 200 or 300 years, maybe a bit longer, when bronze was obviously the key weapon. And that's when you had these great empires like the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians. It all collapsed around 1100 BC, and Troy was part of that. So we think that the Trojan War happened probably around then, around 1180 BC, towards the end of the Bronze Age. But the way they all basically functioned at the time was dealing with each other, making pacts with each other, and then breaking those pacts and then going after each other. Troy was a very big city at the time. It was the gateway to the east. Mycenae was one of the biggest cities on the Greek mainland. So it's highly likely they wanted to form some sort of pact, some sort of economic pact. And if Agamemnon's modus operandi was to bring down, the greatest empire there, then he had his reasoning in Menelaus, his brother, being slighted when his wife is taken. So although that's all liberties taken by the film, by Wolfgang Petersen in the film and whoever wrote it, it is fairly true to life of what Bronze Age culture could have been doing.
Okay. Well, it sounds like basically they're just taking a few lines of text and then turning an entire movie into a few lines. So obviously a lot is going to be filled in and fictional. But that leads into something else I've always been curious about when it comes to ancient texts and such. Do we just assume that they didn't have fiction writers back then, that everything that they wrote actually happened? I mean, we think of movies today. There's so many movies that are strictly for entertainment purposes.
In a way, it's more that than the opposite. They say the first historian is Herodotus, and he doesn't come around to the 4th century BC. So people didn't give a toss about the facts back in the day. If you look at mythology, all the mythologies, the Greek gods and all that stuff, they're all crazy. They're all fantastical. People did not pick up a book for veracity. They didn't pick up to get a gut check on what life was like. So while there was no novel per se, Homer is called an epic poet, and he's ascribe to these two great pieces. But of course, remember, in the Greek time, a few years later, after Troy, you have all of the Greek playwrights, the Sophocles and Euripides and all those kind of people, and those are all fiction. So people very much love to escape into the world of fiction, more so than fact. Historians, I don't even think it was a word yet. So I think when people sat there under a tree listening to Homer tell the Iliad, and it was almost all oral, which is why things change, they weren't looking for facts. They weren't saying, wait a minute, last time you told me that was 1060. Now you're saying it's 1080.
Yeah, no historical letter grade for them.
Yeah, exactly. He sucks, man. Tell me a tale. That's a good one.
Well, a couple other key figures in the movie on the Greek side are King Odysseus of Ithaca, you mentioned, and then the greatest warrior in the world, Achilles. At Agamemnon's bidding, Odysseus convinces Achilles and his elite fighting force called the Myrmidon to fight for Greece against the Trojans. And it's not until later in the movie that we find out Odysseus is doing Agamemnon's bidding, basically out of fear. If he doesn't, then Agamemnon is going to destroy Ithaca. Does the movie do a good job showing the way Odysseus and Achilles fit into the story?
No, they don't. They do a pretty dodgy representation. And again, I think, we talk about the film itself. I think one of the great strengths of the film that I enjoy was Brian Cox's performance as Agamemnon. He's this bullish little pug of a man going around. He's funny. He's enjoyable. And, you like him being a villain. In the Iliad, Agamemnon is very much full of himself, and he's very much full of bravado and makes mistakes, some key ones, which is the crux of the book. But he's also a hero. He's still one of the greatest heroes of the day. In fact, I remember when there's one scene where Hector is asked, "You can fight anybody on a one-on-one. Who would you fight?" He goes, "Well, I won't fight Achilles, Odysseus, or Agamemnon. They're all better than me." So even in the Iliad, Agamemnon is killing men by the dozens, by the thousands. He is definitely a formidable foe. He's not quite the buffoon, the blustering buffoon that he is in the film. And there's no suggestion in the book that Odysseus is his patsy. Now, Odysseus, again, he has the great sequel comes up, and I just reread the Odyssey just a few weeks ago. And I'm reminded how many stupid mistakes Odysseus makes. He was often his own worst enemy. But in the Iliad, he is not some sort of like patsy for Agamemnon. He very much wants the war to end. He wants to get the bloody hell home. And the only way to do that after 10 years is to get Achilles, who they cannot win without, to rejoin the war. So he is doing Agamemnon's bidding because he wants to go bloody hell back to Penelope, and he's sick of it all. So that is kind of whitewashed in the film, and it makes more like Agamemnon is sort of this big warlord that everybody else sort of like, kowtows to. That's not quite the way it is in the book.
Okay, well, that might answer my next question, because as I was watching the movie, something that really seemed odd to me was how clear it was that Odysseus, and in particular Achilles, really don't like Agamemnon. That's why Agamemnon doesn't go to Achilles himself, because, as the movie says, there's only one man he'll listen to. But all I could think of was, if Achilles is the best warrior, and he and Odysseus and maybe all these other Greek provinces conquered by Agamemnon really don't like Agamemnon, why don't Achilles and Odysseus lead a revolt against Agamemnon instead of fighting Troy? Is there anything from history that helps fill in some more context around why so many who didn't like Agamemnon would still fight for him?
Because at the end of the day, this is the age of heroes. And when people listen to the play, it was all no one, no one's going to go home. No one is going to go with their tail behind their legs and go back. So Odysseus and all the others, Nestor and all the other people, the Ajax, all these other people that are in there, none of them want to disappear. None of them want to end the war. They want to win the war, but they don't want to do it. So despite his bluster, they're on Agamemnon's side because they want the same thing. They're all fighting for the same thing, and they're all heroes. Keep in mind, this is mythology, so everybody is painted in a way where they're making great sacrifices and they're doing it for posterity and that kind of stuff. So riding roughshod over the king and then going around him wouldn't be something that a Greek warrior would do. The Greeks were together. They were a unified force. Now, that said, the key tension in the both. I keep talking about the book, but of course the film too is the tension between Achilles and Agamemnon, which is very personal. It's all over a woman, and it's all over, like, two thin-skinned men who can't get on with it. Thousands die because these two people have these petty problems. So Agamemnon definitely comes across, if there's any villain in the book, like the film, and I think the film wisely chose him as a villain, it is Agamemnon, because he sets the whole slaughter of the Greeks and sets the whole tragedy in motion. He's too proud to apologize to Achilles after he slighted him. So those are all very personal things. Though I think Odysseus and the other just kind of want to stay clear of it. They just want to get back to war. So I don't think going around the king, who's the leader of men, as he's keep calling the book, would be the way to do that in a Greek play.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense, because in the movie, it just kind of seems like Achilles is in the center of it all, and whatever side he's on is going to win. So why would he bother to fight for somebody he doesn't even like, when he could turn the tides as the greatest warrior of all to fight against Agamemnon if he wanted to? Whatever side he's on is going to win.
It is true. And he is, and certainly in the play too, they talk about how he's the fleet-footed greatest warrior of all time. He can kill thousands with one slice. So, everybody, the whole Greek army starts to die because he decides to sit the war out. That's how important one guy is. So he certainly could take over for Agamemnon. But there's also, in terms of, the one thing the film did, and it's got a lot of controversy from, I guess, people who know the play so well, or the poem so well, is they got rid of the gods. And I understand why they do. But the one thing that you get when you read Homer that is not in the films is the gods are always meddling. So someone is always whispering. Athena is always whispering in Agamemnon's ear, do this, do that. So they're all being spurred on by the gods, and of course, the others don't want to piss the god off by going against their favorite. So you have that key element where the reason all these people are the gift of men is because they have help from Mount Olympus. And you don't want to piss off Mount Olympus. So you just kind of ride it out.
Yeah, we don't want to piss off Mount Olympus. I like that. Well, back in the movie, the Greeks launched their attack, sending 1,000 ships bearing 50,000 soldiers to Troy. The battle begins with Achilles and his Myrmidons landing on the beaches of Troy first, and he leads them in slaughtering the defending Trojan archers. Then they move on to the nearby temple to Apollo. There, Achilles kills all the priests and desecrates the temple itself by cutting off the head of a statue and telling his men they're free to take whatever treasure they want. Hector's soldiers arrive, but they're all killed as well. And there are only 2 Trojans who survive this initial battle. One is Hector, who Achilles lets go free because he says it's too early in the day for killing princes. And the other is Hector's cousin, Briseis, which Achilles takes as a captive. Is that how the Battle of Troy really began?
None of that happened. In fact, I think it's one of the weakest scenes in the film. I can only imagine they put that in there to show Brad Pitt, being stronger, to get a battle scene early on, to show he comes to Troy all muscled up and oiled up, and he's taking charge. Okay, remind you again, the Iliad opens in year 10, so they're already been entrenched in the muddy, camps for 10 years. But even then, it's a very curious, and I think a very, very weak sequence, because historically, it's a mess. Those are Greeks, those are Egyptian statues in the back. They're basing them more on Egyptian myths rather than anything Greek. So they're borrowing from Abydos and Abu Simbel and a lot of Egyptian, and messing it up with some Assyrian stuff. They're making it up by making it look a little Greek, but it's very much an Egyptian motif, which is totally wrong there. And then also the whole thing just seems so crude for Achilles to come in and start killing the gods and killing the priests and everything. It feels like it was done by committee to show an action sequence early in the film, and it does nothing to advance the plot. None of that is in the book. Achilles and Hector don't meet until they're one-on-one, out front. There's no scene there. There's no sense of that. So absolutely none of that is accurate.
Okay, well, maybe it's like you're saying, doing an action sequence right up front for entertainment purposes, but also they just mentioned Achilles being the greatest warrior, and so they have to show him being the greatest warrior. And they also point out that in the movie, at least, they point out that clearing the beaches is this great feat, and Achilles is basically able to do that by himself.
It's true. It's a good point because you got to show if he is the greatest warrior, we got to see why early on. We can't just talk about it. But of course, all he kills is a bunch of priests and one temple. It's not exactly the most impressive win of all time. So the whole thing is just a very curious sequence that just rang hollow to me.
That's a very, very good point. Well, after that vicious start to the battle on the beaches, Paris offers to end the war in the movie before it goes any further. He wants to fight King Menelaus of Sparta in this one-on-one battle for Helen. And in this fight, Menelaus gets the advantage of Paris, who then turns to his brother Hector for help. Menelaus is about to kill Paris when Hector ends up killing Menelaus. And this just enrages Agamemnon and the Greeks, who then launch a full-scale attack on Troy. But according to the movie, they're driven back and forced to retire to their camp on the beaches. Did this battle between Paris and Menelaus actually happen?
It did, but it doesn't end the way it does in the film. And another very curious change they make. And again, I think because the filmmakers must have known they're doing a one-off. They're not talking about great Greek gods that are going to be around forever. They're making one thing, they're done. So the beginning starts the way it does in the book, where Paris and Menelaus fight. And what's interesting in the book is it also makes Paris out to be sort of like the dweeb he is, because he's very much mismatched by Menelaus. And what happens there is Menelaus is about to kill him, and I forget which goddess it is, comes and saves him and cocoons him so he doesn't die. He doesn't crawl underneath his brother's legs, but he is about to be killed by Menelaus, and he survives. That's how it ends. Menelaus does not die. In fact, Menelaus goes on and he goes back, and he's a big character in the Odyssey. He goes back to his family and his wife and his Greek kingdom, and he has Helen in his arms. Helen goes back with him. So in the Odyssey, when Odysseus pops by to say hello, he's there with Helen, and she's like, mixing up drinks for them. It's kind of like just popping by. Menelaus does not die. There's a very curious thing that they did to kill him off. And I guess it is because the characters to a film audience in 2004 don't have quite the resonance they do to a Greek scholar or something. So it's okay to kill off these Greek people. And they make him very much, he is kind of a crass character in Homer too. So they kind of get that right, where he's not he's not like his brother. He's a brute. And while he's strong, he's not bright at all. He's definitely a hothead. So you don't mind probably seeing him die. He's a good person to kill off, but he is not killed off the way he is in the book by Hector.
Okay. It just seems a tad bit different than what we see in the movie.
In a different direction, doesn't
Well,
it?
according to the movie, a relationship starts to form between Achilles and a Trojan priestess, Briseis. That's how they pronounce it in the movie that he captured. Achilles seems tired of fighting for Agamemnon, so he orders his men to stay while Agamemnon goes to battle. But then, while Achilles is in his tent with Briseis, Achilles' beloved cousin, Patroclus, wears Achilles' armor and leads the Myrmidon into battle. They think it's Achilles that they're following. And then when these soldiers fight their way to Hector, Hector ends up killing the man they all think is Achilles, until taking off his helmet, and it's revealed that it's Patroclus. So that's how the movie shows Achilles ending up recommitting to the fight against the Trojans to avenge his cousin's death. How much of that is based on real history?
That is a very, very key point in the book, and that's very close to what happens. The emotional core of the book is just that. And they say brace this. There's different ways of saying it, but essentially, the whole plot of the Iliad in a nutshell is in the 10th year of the war, they're sitting around, they're trying to bring down Troy, and one way to do that is to do a bunch of raids and attack the villages and fill up the gates with refugees, and then take a bunch of war brides and then, have their way with them. Breas actually comes from that. She's not related in any way to anyone inside the Troy. That is Achilles' war booty from a recent raid that happens off camera. And At the same time, Agamemnon gets his own. I forget her name. What is it? Chryseis? Or I forgot to say it. And her father comes by, and he's a priest of Apollo, and says, "Give her back." And he says, "You must be joking. I'm going to kill you if you don't leave right now." He said, "No, I need my daughter back. I will give you everything I own. Just give me my daughter back." So she's the daughter of a priestess, not a priestess herself. Agamemnon in his bluster sends him out, says, "I will kill you if you don't leave now." And as he leaves, he curses them and says, "You will regret this." And they do. So as soon as the priest leaves, he calls out to Apollo, who sends a plague down and wipes out half of the Trojan or half of the Greeks and kills them until his daughters returned. Agamemnon refuses for a while and then eventually says, "Oh, you know what? I'll give her back. I'll take Achilles' war bride instead." So he takes Breis as his concubine instead, and that pisses Achilles off so much he sits out the war. He stopped, and that's when things go to shit. So basically, that is all of the Iliad is really about these two men and these two women, and these women are pretty powerless, unfortunately, in the book. But because his war bride or his war booty, whatever it called, has been taken away, Achilles refuses to fight, and they start to suffer. They come and they beg him and they beg him, and it's only when Patroclus, who in my book and in many other um, historians' belief, it was Achilles' real lover, his second cousin, but also his same sex lover, and they say, "Well, we have to get them out there. If you will not fight, how can we get the Greeks to go out there and fight as if you are? They need to believe you're with them." So he and Patroclus form a decision. You go out there, you wear my armor, and they think it's me, and they will win, and I still won't fight because he's a petulant child too. Unfortunately, Patroclus isn't as strong as him, and he goes on and gets slaughtered by Hector. So all of that happens, and then when Achilles finds out that his beloved has been killed by Hector, he rejoins the war effort, and then Troy falls.
So many people killed just because of these
Yes.
egos.
It all comes down to these two arrogant men who just refuse to think about anybody but themselves. First, Agamemnon lets thousands die because of a plague because he won't give up. Some random woman, he probably got 10 women in his tent. And then Achilles watches all his brethren die because they took away this woman who he barely has any relationship with. If they're in love, Homer doesn't suggest it. There's much more love even in Homer between him and Patroclus than it is in him and her. So it's a very strange thing that he just sits out the war and lets thousands and thousands of people he grew up with die because of one woman.
It almost sounds similar to what we were talking about before with Agamemnon using the slight against Menelaus as an excuse to do something he already wanted to do, attacking Troy. It sounds like maybe Achilles might be doing a similar thing and using just this minor slight against a woman that maybe he didn't even really care that much about to do something he didn't want to do anyway, which is sit out the fight, or, he didn't want to fight. So he's just going to do that anyway.
Well, there's one other, and again, the Greek writers wouldn't say this because I think the age of the hero wouldn't allow it, but some other people have interpreted his sitting out the war. Remember, there's a very early scene in the film where Julie Christie as his mom comes and says, "If you go to Troy, you will die. It is, you go to Troy, you will live forever, but you will die. Or you cannot go to Troy, you will be anonymous and you will have a full life." So some have speculated maybe one of the reasons he sits it out is he realizes, well, I don't want to die. I'd rather anonymity and live like a human being than be a hero and then die at age 18 or whatever the hell he is. That is not in Homer, but certainly there is the book is shot through with this idea of everyone becoming immortal. So just by him being there, he will die. Just by him partaking, because everything is written by the gods. So you could argue that maybe one of the reasons he did it, if you're adding some element that may be human but not necessarily in the Homer original, is that he's sitting it out again because he's decided that, living forever isn't worth it. There's a wonderful scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus is looking. Why does he go to Hades? I forget the reason, but he goes to Hades, um, looking for his way home or something, and he meets all the people who died after the war, including Agamemnon and Achilles. And Achilles says quite famously, "I'd rather be a beggar to some man up above than the king of the gods down below." And and then that basically said he's regretting dying. So when he's in Hades, when you basically live forever, but you're no longer human, he regrets it. He would rather be up above being a nobody than down below and being a hero forever. So that is something that is very much a theme throughout all of Homer. This idea of destiny, this idea of fate. Fate is really what it is. And he is fated to die. And if he had one chance to do it, it would have been then by sitting out the war. It isn't until his lover is taken from him that he realizes he has to see his fate through.
I could see that too. You mentioned the scene in the movie with his mother where he's, talking about living in immortality. But, in that moment before the fighting actually begins, especially being that young, you might think, oh, this is such a great thing, living in immortality. And then once the fighting begins, you might have a change of heart.
And keep in mind for what? At the end of the day, they're all fighting so one guy can get his wife back.
Yeah. And not even fighting for yourself. You're fighting for somebody else. Yeah.
So there's a bunch of boorish, brutish men that really should just get over it, But he'll go over and spend 10 years and die. And certainly there's a lot of sequences in Homer where people are already sick and they want to go home. And it's very unpleasant. They're living in rain among rats and pestilence, and they're living in the boats and tents along the shore. And, it's just an ugly existence. They're away from home. They're all dreaming about their wives and their families. Most of them don't make it. So certainly it's not a rosy picture, what life is like and what war is like in the Bronze Age.
Well, if we go back to the movie, as soon as Achilles finds out his cousin has been killed, he races to the Trojan city walls and yells for Hector to face him in one-on-one combat. Hector complies and goes out to face Achilles, and it's a valiant fight between two great warriors, but Achilles is the better warrior, so he kills Hector and then drags Hector's body from his chariot in front of the city walls for all the Trojans to watch. Do we know if this fight between two legendary warriors happened the way we see it in the movie?
It happens that way in the book. They got that right, and you call right or wrong. Again, it's not they have to be gospel when it comes to interpreting a 3,000-year-old book. You take liberties that they want. I suppose I'll give it that much, But that is very much what happens. There's a very strong sequence in the chapter in the book. And by that point, it's very interesting because what Homer does is he has created sympathies on both sides. Hector is a man of honor. And they kind of do that in the film. They make Paris much more of a dweeb, which maybe he is. But certainly Hector in both the film and in the poem is very much the strongest man in Troy. And he is obviously meant to take over from King Priam, his father. So his loss will be a great thing. So it is not an evenly match because Achilles is Achilles, but Hector is a very strong and formidable opponent, and he has a lot of people on his side who respect that. So, it is probably one of the most powerful scenes in the play, or in the poem, because you have sympathies on both sides. You really care about the characters.
Well, that leads into another question I want to ask about at this point in the movie, because at this point we've seen a few one-on-one fights, right? The movie starts with Agamemnon calling on Achilles to fight the Thessalians champion, a guy named Boagrius. Then later, there's that one-on-one fight between Paris and Menelaus that we already talked about. And now there's this one-on-one fight between Achilles and Hector. Historically speaking, were these one-on-one fights that we see sprinkled throughout the movie, were they common?
Historically, no, but certainly in ancient literature. They're a trope. They were much a trope like any book you read today, like any romantic comedy, whatever, has their own tropes. An ancient story had their tropes in one-on-one because it's mano y mano. The first one in the film doesn't happen at all, where Achilles fights whoever that character is. I think they're totally fictional. And then you think about it, probably the most famous one-on-one fight in all literature, certainly if you read your Bible growing up, is David and Goliath. So you have that one. It's already, then that's probably what that was based on. They probably would steal it from that. But then you also have, even in the very obscure Egyptian text called the Tale of Sinuhe, about a guy who leaves Egypt and tries to come back to die. He has a one-on-one battle with an Egyptian warrior to get in. Romulus in the Roman legend fights this warrior named Akron to bring supremacy, to bring the tribes of Rome together. It's a trope, and it's all about kind of like, it shows the prowess of one man up against the best and winning. So certainly in you have two of them in the Iliad, and the first one, of course, goes against Hector, and he kind of becomes a slobbering dweeb, but the other one is a very emotional crux of the entire story arc, where you take the two biggest characters and bring them together.
I could see that. And we even see that in movies too, if you think about it. You think of these movies with the huge epic battles of thousands and thousands on either side. It's really hard to honestly care about these huge just numbers of people on either side. And so you focus in on just a few people on either side, whether it's an ensemble or, composite characters or just these one-on-ones. And so I could see if that's the case in movies, that would be the same thing in writing too.
If you read the Iliad, and I recommend everybody should, because there's some beautiful stuff in there, and it can be very dramatic. There's a slog too, where they go on and talk about somebody killing somebody from a small town in eastern Turkey. And you don't know who they are, and it's boring because you have no emotional connection with them. Like any Marvel movie, it's when the hero fights the villain. It's that one, think of the classic end of Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where the good, the bad, and the ugly have a Mexican standoff and a bunch of close-ups of all their eyeballs back and forth. That's where you want it to end. You want all the noise to go away, and you want to come down to the most primal, which is this mano-a-mano fight to the finish. Look me in the eye. And that's certainly something that goes all the way back to, again, David and Goliath and these ancient texts that still resonate today.
Well, back in the movie's storyline, after Hector is killed, the Trojan king Priam sneaks into the Greek camp to ask Achilles for Hector's body. They remain enemies, the movie makes it clear, but Achilles seems to have respect for both Hector and Priam, so he grants the request. He turns over the body and offers a 12-day peace because, according to the movie, the funeral games last for 12 days. That's both in Achilles' country as well as Priam's. And so there's a peace for 12 days. Was there really a 12-day peace during the Trojan War for the funeral of Hector like we see in the movie?
What's interesting is that's also how the book ends. The book ends right there. That is the last scene of the Iliad. And I think it's probably the best scene of the movie, too. It helps to have Peter O'Toole in there, who can act up a storm on everybody else. So you have these veterans in there that just by walking in a room, you're interested in them because they have such presence. I wish there was more Prime and maybe less of who's the cipher that played Paris?
Orlando Bloom. Legolas from Lord of the Rings, yeah.
Bloom, more O'Toole would have been my review. That's very much how it ends. And it finally shows Achilles breaking down because he's brooding and angry he can't get over Patroclus' death. So, finally, and then that's why he kills Hector. But this man comes to him, and I think it's the best line in the film. I forget how it is. I'm paraphrasing again, but it's something like Achilles says, "If I do this for you, you're still my enemy tomorrow." And O'Toole's character, Prime, says, "You're still my enemy tonight, but we can still be human," or something like that. It's a wonderful scene. And I wish there was more of that emotion in the film. I think that reminds you that Achilles could have been a real character as opposed to this sort of pin-up, greased up muscle boy. So I think that suggested what the film could have been. But yes, that's very much how the book ends. And in terms of the 12 days, whether that was typical in Bronze Age culture, I don't know. But that is what they say in the Iliad. It is 12 days. And the book ends with Prime getting up, thanking him, taking his boy's body. And then there's a paragraph after then where you hear them burning. You watch them burning Hector's body and people watching it. And that's how the book ends.
Oh, okay. Well, the movie keeps going, so we'll keep going too. It's not too much of a surprise at this point in the movie that Agamemnon is just furious when he finds out that Achilles agreed to a 12-day peace without his approval. But then again, the movie also points out that Troy was built to withstand a 10-year siege. So it's not like they can do a lot to get past the city walls anyway at that point. Is the movie's claim of Troy's city walls being built to withstand a 10-year siege historically accurate?
I mean, 10 years seems outrageous for any kind of war. Certainly any war that took place back then. Again, it's kind of like, 40 days and 40 nights and all these kind of cliches. You hear Alibaba's 40 thieves. There are some numbers that just fit. And 10 years seems to be a nice long hunk of time where you can imagine people getting a bit miffed. So there is no truth. I mean, certainly some cities can withstand sieges forever. Others will fall straight away, depending on duplicity or a crack in the wall. So it's hard to know what the Troy of Prime was like. Now, they have found, as we were talking earlier, Troy, we do know Troy exists because a archaeologist named Schliemann found in the 1880s, it's in Turkey, and you can go there today. It's a very disappointing sight because it's all denuded and ripped apart. There's nothing except a really cheesy wooden horse in the car park, which was put there in the 1970s by like some Turkish filmmaker making a TV movie. It's even got little windows. It looks like somebody laughed. It's so cheesy. Got big knobs on it, the stairs going up. It's not all the authentic thing. But Troy stood for 1,000 years, at some form of Troy, up 1,000 years. Now, what level was the Trojan War at? Was probably somewhere in the lower third, maybe like the fourth or fifth layer. They have different strata, and I forget right now which one it is. So Troy itself lasted a very long time, and Troy was rebuilt after Prime's time. So it's we don't know how strong it was then. There's actually Roman ruins there too. So it's still around in Roman times. So to say that it can withstand a siege X years long, I think is impossible to say. And of course, they saw that anyways with the Trojan horse through duplicity by getting those doors open, which is one of the most, it's hard to believe anybody falling for that ever. Even in ancient times, it's like, oh, there's enormous wooden horse outside my door. Let's bring it inside the gates that we'd kept closed for a decade.
I mean, we still have people falling for Trojan horses today with computer viruses. But that leads right into my next question, because if we head back to the movie, we're at the point where we see perhaps the most famous part of the war, the Trojan horse. The movie shows this idea coming to Odysseus as he's watching one of his soldiers carve a wooden horse for his son back home. And then after the 12-day funeral for Hector, the Trojans come out and they find the Greeks are no longer on the beaches. Instead, they just find some dead bodies with what they think is the plague. That's something that the Trojan priest there says is retribution from Apollo for the way the Greeks desecrated the temple, alluding to the attack on the beach that Achilles did. We talked about earlier when the Greeks first landed. And then they also find this huge wooden horse, which they think was built by the Greeks as an offering for Poseidon to grant the Greeks a safe return home. That same priest convinces King Priam to take the horse to their own temple of Poseidon, and that brings the horse within the city walls. And then that night, Odysseus, Achilles, and maybe a dozen or so Greeks sneak out of the horse, kill the sleeping guards, and open the city gates for the waiting Greek army. Does the movie accurately portray what we know of the Trojan horse?
No, I mean, again, we don't even know if the Trojan War happened, and so keep asking minutiae questions on a thesis that's already flawed. It's hard to imagine a Trojan War happening. It's something torn from myth, and it was quite interesting. Although it's definitely the most famous thing from the Trojan War, that and maybe the heel, it only gets about 3 or 4 lines, not in the Iliad, but in the Odyssey, where someone is asking Odysseus on one of his islands where he's stuck, how did you get away? And he tells them over like a leg of lamb or whatever what happened. It's like a paragraph long. It is a cliff note. So it's very interesting that it becomes the most famous thing, probably because it's so dramatic and it's so cinematic and it's a great ending. It's a great ending, no matter how ridiculous it is. And as you described it, as how it's described in the Odyssey, that pretty much is how they do it. I don't know if it's a plague, they say they leave, but they wake up and the Greeks all hide behind a promontory out in the bay, all their ships, and they act like they've left. And they've left this wooden horse behind, not for the Greeks, but for Apollo to say, sorry, we've been, mucking up the earth and mucking up with the heavens, and when we're out of here. And Prime thinks that it's for them, and he takes it in, and they sneak out. So yes, that happens as described in the Odyssey. Did it happen in real life? I think I could hazard a no. We don't know if any of these people existed. Neilman also claimed he found the city of Agamemnon. He calls it Agamemnon's Mask in central Greece, Mycenae, but we don't know if it's Agamemnon. He very much wanted to be Agamemnon. These are mythological characters that might have been based on fact, but they were heroes. They were touched by gods, so they could be as real as Apollo and Athena and all the others.
Sounds a lot like, too, characters like King Arthur and Robin Hood, these stories that there might be fragments of truth here and there, but just built upon for thousands of years, that it's really hard to separate fact from fiction, or how much of it is actually fact at all.
It could have been an amalgamation of several different people. They could have been totally invented. Again, the Trojan War itself. I mean, if you look at the ruins of Troy, it was destroyed many times and burnt. And they think they found the level of when Troy of Prime's Troy collapsed, but we don't know how or why and all those kind of things. So it's impossible to say it happened because of a 10-year war with the Greeks, or it was just burnt because someone left a space heater out overnight.
It was the Trojan horse you're talking about with the window, the sun going through the glass and everything, causing the fire to ignite.
Anything could happen.
Well, at the very end of the movie, we see the Greek soldiers within the city walls. And once they're inside, it's all over for Troy. The city is burning when Achilles searches for Briseis. She ends up killing Agamemnon when he tries to take her captive. But then Achilles kills the Greek guards to rescue her. And then Paris shows up and he hits Achilles in his heel with an arrow. Achilles gets up and Paris ends up hitting Achilles with 4 more arrows in the chest. But Achilles isn't quite dead yet. He manages to pull the arrows out of himself, and then Paris and Briseis follow the path that Hector's wife, Andromache, shows them out of the city, into the island, deeper in the island where the Greeks won't follow. And then once they leave, we see a bunch of Greek soldiers showing up to find Achilles die. And the only arrow left, because he pulled the others out of his chest, the only one left is the one stuck in his heel. How much of the way the movie ends holds up to historical scrutiny?
None of that happens except for Paris does kill Achilles with an arrow to the heel. And I think it is off camera as well, or off the page. And again, this is from the Odyssey, not from the Iliad. I think maybe when Odysseus goes to Hades and is talking to his dead friends, that's when Achilles tells him, "Oh, I was duped by that little snot, and he killed me." But everything else, didn't happen. And in particularly, Agamemnon does not die there. Agamemnon is killed, I think, by Briseis. Who kills him in the film?
It's Briseis. Yeah, because Agamemnon was going to take her as his own prize, and then she had like a dagger hidden, and she ends up pulling it out and stabbing him. Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't happen. I mean, he lives and he goes back to Mycenae, and of course, there's a very famous Greek play about that, where he's killed by his wife and her lover. She stacked up with someone else in the last 10 years, so when he comes back, he's killed in his tub, I believe, by his own wife and his wife's new lover. So he goes all the way back to his homeland, only to die that ignoble death.
I guess I shouldn't laugh at somebody dying, but we think of this guy is responsible for how many thousands of deaths because of his own ego and just the way all the deaths he caused, and then he goes back and dies that way. Kind of gets what's coming to you.
And it is like it happens that way after. We're just kind of like slipping on a banana peel or something after you've taken on the whole world. But all those characters go on to have sort of sequels again. As I mentioned, a lot of them show up in the Odyssey, but other plays are mentioned about some of the survivors after the fact. Now, Helen disappears from history. Briseis disappears from history. All the women tend to do that. Achilles is dead, except for his cameo in Hades. Odysseus goes back and becomes a hero. But Prime, we don't even know how Prime dies. We assume Prime dies. I think in the book he's killed by Agamemnon. Doesn't happen in the book. So we can only imagine if a city falls, so does the king.
Yeah, I kind of got the idea of, the captain going down with the ship was the impression I got from the film.
And the thing that you have, there's people leaving at the end, sneaking out. Paris wasn't among them. We don't know if he left, but there was a very famous Roman play by Virgil called the Aeneid. And that is basically trying to connect themselves to the Greeks and saying they are the descendants of the famous Greeks, but one comes to us and starts the Romans, you know. So a hero from Troy. So basically, when them leaving, that's pretty much how the Aeneid begins. It begins with them leaving and picking up the story from the fall of Troy. So that's sort of setting up. If there was a sequel, would have been that the Roman version of what happens next.
Okay, maybe that's where King Arthur comes into it, because I know there's a thought that he might have actually been a Roman centurion, then led to the myths that we know now.
Yeah, it's quite say everybody wants to be Roman because they were the top dog for so long.
Well, the movie does talk about it being like 3,200 years ago, and you've talked a little bit here and there about the Trojan ruins, and then talked about some other ruins that obviously that you've been to as well. Do you think the movie does a good job transporting us back in time 3,200 years?
You know, it's funny because I'm writing a book about Troy. I talked to some archaeologists who dug there, and they put me on to a book. I think it was by Michael Woods, who was a archaeologist, an old book back in the 80s. He did a bunch of BBC docs you might have seen back in the day, British guy. And they said we all kind of look at him as being the perfect example. He created mock-ups of what Troy might have looked like. And the filmmakers must have got that same book because it looks a lot like that. So I think the sets are quite nice. I think except for mixing up the gods, as I mentioned in the first scene, and anytime you see ancient history, those of us who are snobs with it, and I'm no archaeologist or historian, I'm a filmmaker and a novelist who spends a lot of time with those people. You see a bit of a Hittite, a bit of Egyptian, a bit of a Phoenician, whatever's cool looking, wing bulls, Assyrian wing bulls, you know, next to Baal and all this stuff. It all makes her exotically ancient. But I thought in terms of how the walls looked and how the city looked, it captured it quite nicely. It transported me. I wasn't sort of like sniffing my nose at it.
It's whatever looks good on camera, right? Yeah.
It has to look epic. It has to look epic, and I think they did that. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned you're writing a book, and this has just been a lot of fun to dig into the myths, legends, and history behind Troy. Now, before I let you go, I think anyone who is a fan of historical stories that we talked about today would love to read your historical novels. So can you share a little bit more about those? For anyone watching the video version of this, I am holding up Primetime Pompeii, but you also have Primetime Travelers, and could there be a Primetime Troy on the way?
Maybe. Yeah, it's a series, and it's not hard. You know, I'm a TV producer by trade. I've been the last 30 years making historical documentaries for BBC, National Geographic. Right now, working for the History Channel. So I work for all of them, and my bailiwick has always been history, archaeology, and I've been to some 70 countries. And you know, after traveling and all doing all these footnoted scripts where all the facts had to be exact, like we're talking about right now, I'm doing exactly the same thing the filmmakers of Troy are doing. I'm making shit up. And I wanted to have some fun with what I know. So Primetime Travelers is about a TV crew, kind of, you know, a fairly cheesy ancient aliens like TV crew who find the order to the past and it allows them to go to the ancient past, hopefully to win an Emmy. And they get sucked into the great events of ancient times. The first book is them going back to ancient Egypt during the times of Ramses the Great. And they have to find a mummy in the Duat, which is the 12 hours of hell before the sun rises. So I get all the mythology of Egypt I was able to bring in there and recreate ancient Egypt and the new kingdom under Ramses. The second book, they time travel back to Pompeii on the eve of Pompeii with a snooty TV host, you know, along with them. They just can't wait to die. And I won't give anything away. You know, but let's just say, you know, things happen. And when in the third book, which I'm writing right now, Primetime Troy, they go back to ancient Troy with the invite of Achilles. And the setup there is exactly what I'm talking about before. Achilles realizes, oh, you people can change history. You can make documentaries, make people live forever without being in an epic poem. I don't want to die. I will give you a ring-size seat to Troy if you figure out how to let me live.
Okay.
And
like living forever, like literally living forever, or like living forever throughout legend?
Oh, he wants to become a human being. He wants to go off of Patroclus and live a life of happiness with Patroclus. So, but he's also, a hero of the book, and he basically wants them to see if anyone can change the past, the time traveler TV producers can, because you've done it twice now. So that's the hope and seed. Of course, he's got a few tricks up his sleeve, and you can't quite trust him. So basically, all these books are in a way to kind of have fun with the past, with mythology, with history. Don't screw with time and all that stuff. But also, I just want to be able to take all the stuff I know about the ancient world, Rome, Greece, and Egypt, and just get people excited about it where it's not a heavy treaty on, you don't have to read Homer. My book is easier to read than Homer, let's just say. And it's funny. It's a comedic book. So obviously it skewers television as much as anything else. So it definitely is a lighthearted way of time traveling to very violent, distant times.
I imagine maybe 1,000 years from now, people would take just a few lines from your book and make another movie similar to what they did with Troy and with Homer's writings from thousands of years ago.
Or this is the only thing that survives, and they'll assume that time travel was real and that the gods are really a bunch of TV producers with cameras and drones.
Yes.
The incidents of history are amazing. I love the fact of what survives and what doesn't, and that's all sometimes we know about entire culture. Because one papyri, was saved underneath a falling pillar. So that's all we know about entire culture.
Yeah, sometimes it's just luck, right? Well, I'll make sure to add a link to all your books in the show notes so that we can increase the chances of it living forever. Thank you again so much for your time, Neil. This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. Thank you once again to Neil Laird for helping us separate fact from fiction in Troy. As Neil mentioned at the end there, his book about Troy is not out yet, but that's part 3 in his series, so that just means you have time to catch up with Primetime Travelers and Primetime Pompeii. Hop into the show notes to find links for all of those, or as always, you'll find links to them on the show's home on the web at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/366. And as soon as the new book is out, you can be sure that link will be in the show notes as well. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, the Trojan War started when Achilles kidnapped Agamemnon's wife, Helen. Number 2, we know there was a Troy, but we don't even know if there was a Trojan horse. Number 3, one-on-one duels were common literature tools, but not an ancient battle strategy. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Got the answer right here, so let's open that up. And the lie is number 1. There are multiple things wrong with number 1. First, Helen was Agamemnon's sister-in-law. In other words, she was married to Menelaus of Sparta. Menelaus was Agamemnon's brother. And then it was Paris who swept Helen away to Troy. Achilles had his differences with Agamemnon, but Achilles fought on Agamemnon's side against the Trojans. At least, that's how the story goes. As Neil pointed out, there's a lot that we don't know for sure because it's just really hard to nitpick a 3,000-year-old story like this one. But thank you so much for sticking around to the end. Before I let you go for today, if you did enjoy today's episode, you'll love my mailing list. In these days where every social platform has its own algorithm, following or subscribing doesn't really mean what it used to. So I've started up an email mailing list to cut through all of that. And you'll find a link to the Boats email newsletter in the show notes, along with all the links that we talked about today. Or you can always reach out to me directly at dan@basedonatruestorypodcast.com if you want to share an idea for a future episode, or maybe you just watched an awesome historical movie or TV show and you want to talk to someone about it. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Neil and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.